Welcome to the next teaching unit in grid-connected PV systems. Here we will take a closer look at dynamic investment calculation. In the first teaching unit, I already mentioned, in addition to the static payback period, there are also dynamic methods that allow a somewhat more accurate assessment of the profitability. These dynamic methods are characterized on the one hand by the fact that the income and expenses are considered individually for each year, and on the other hand, the value of money at the time of payment is taken into account. We'll discuss this in more detail in a moment. By considering the income and expenses for each year individually, effects such as a power degradation of the PV system or rising electricity prices can also be taken into account in the calculation of the income. Let's take another look at the example PV plant, which we have also considered in the calculation of the payback period. For this plant we calculated a yield of 8,800 kilowatt hours. If we now assume an average annual power degradation of 0.5%, however, the yield will drop to just under 8,000 kilowatt hours over the course of 20 years. Accordingly, the income from the feed-in tariff also decreases. For the calculation of the saved electricity costs, we again assume a self-consumption share of 30% and electricity costs of 32 euro-cents per kilowatt hours. In addition, we now also take into account rising electricity prices here. In the last 15 years, electricity prices in Germany have increased by 2.5% per year. This value has already been adjusted for inflation. We set this price increase as an expectation for the next 20 years. Overall, this means that the electricity costs saved will increase over the years. In total, there are now different incomes for each year. So now we have calculated the expected future income of our PV system. But as I've already mentioned, the time value of money is also taken into account in the dynamic methods. For this purpose, the so-called discount rate is usually used. It is used to discount payments in the future to the present value of money. But what does discounting mean? To understand this term, let's look at a simple example. Your boss offers you a bonus payment for a job well done. Either you will receive 5,000 euro directly or 6,000 euro in 3 years. To find out which option offers the greater value, we can convert the amounts to a common present value. Let's look at compounding first. To do this, we assume that you cash out the bonus payment immediately and invest the 5,000 euro. This results in interest and compound interest. We can calculate the money value after 3 years with the so-called compounding factor. The I in this formula stands for the interest rate. In practice, this results from various factors, such as the current prime rate. N stands for the number of years by which the original amount is to be compounded. Let us assume an interest rate of 5%. Over 3 years, this results in a compounding factor of 1.16. The monetary value of after 3 years is therefore 5,788 euro. Alternatively, you can calculate the other way around and look at the present value of a payment of 6,000 euro received in 3 years. To do this, we do not use the compounding factor but the discounting factor. It is exactly the inverse of the compounding factor. For discounting over 3 years and an interest rate of 5%, it is 0.86. A bonus payment of 6,000 euro received in 3 years is therefore equivalent to just under 5,183 in today's money value. Both calculations yield the same result. A bonus payment of 6,000 euro in 3 years corresponds to a higher monetary value. In the case of an investment, such as a PV system, the amount of the investment can be provided in 2 ways. Throughout equity capital, meaning savings, or throughout borrowed capital, meaning a loan. Mixed financing is also possible. For example, we could have a share of equity of 20%, while 80% are financed by a loan. For the equity, the plant operator, in this case, misses out on the return income he would receive if he invested the money. In the case of the loan, on the other hand, the plant operator has to pay interest. To calculate the discount rate, the return on equity and the interest on the debt are weighted according to the shares of debt and equity. However, the decrease in the value of money due to inflation is not yet taken into account in this discount rate. This is also referred to as a nominal interest rate. For example, let's assume a long-term average inflation rate of 2% per year. In this case, the real discount rate is approximately 1.4%. With the real discount rate, we can now discount the annual income and expenses of our PV system and thereby obtain the values that would correspond to the cash flow today. These values are also called present values. The sum of the present values corresponds to the discount surplus that the PV system will generate over its entire lifetime. If we subtract the investment cost from the sum, we obtain the so-called net present value, after which this calculation method is named. If the net present value is positive, it is generally a profitable investment. In this case, the investor not only gets back his investment capital, but also an interest rate that exceeds the applied discount rate interest rate. If, on the other hand, the net present value is negative, the investment sum is higher than the expected cash flow. The investment thus yields less profit than a risk-free bank investment of the same amount. Finally, I would like to introduce you to a parameter that is frequently used in the context of energy production plants, the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. The LCOE specifies the costs that arise over the entire lifetime of a plant in relation to the total amount of produced energy in kilowatt hours. The LCOE can be used, for example, to compare different energy generation systems such as photovoltaics, wind energy, or fossil fuel power plants. The LCOE of a plant can be calculated using the equation shown here, which is based on the net present value method. The numerator contains the investment cost, I0, and the present values of the operating cost, AT. In other words, all the costs that arise over the lifetime of the plant are listed here. The denominator contains the present values of the yields of the PV system in kilowatt hours. It may seem confusing at first glance that the energy yields of the systems are discounted to present values, since they are not monetary amounts. The underlying idea is that the revenues corresponds to earnings, which must be discounted accordingly. The calculation of the LCOE does not take into account influences such as feed-in tariff, self-consumption regulations, or tax rules. As a result, they are not suitable for determining the profitability of a specific plant. They are mainly used to compare different technology with each other. Depending on the plant location and the level of investment costs, the LCOE can vary greatly. The discount rate also has a major influence on the level of the LCOE. As an example, here are the LCOEs of various power generation plants in Germany from a study conducted by Fraunhofer ISE in 2021. According to this study, the LCOE for photovoltaic systems in Germany in 2021 ranged from 3 to 11 cents per kilowatt hour. The lowest values are achieved by large ground-mounted systems in the solar-rich south of Germany. Small rooftop systems in northern Germany have the highest LCOE. For photovoltaic storage systems, the LCOE range between 5 and 20 cents per kilowatt hour. The wide range here is mainly due to the high cost differences between the different battery systems. Let's summarize this teaching unit. In contrast to static investment calculation, dynamic methods take into account the current value of money as well as the changes in income and operating costs over time. An example of the dynamic methods is the net present value method. where the net present value is used to decide whether an investment is economically profitable. The net present value method can be used to calculate the levelized cost of electricity, which enables a comparison of different technologies. I thank you for your attention.